Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video, we're going to compare the lying leg curl and the seated leg curl. Both are obviously exercises that you could possibly use to train your hamstrings. Now, before we kind of get into this, just keep in mind that from a purely personal training perspective, if you have access to either pieces of equipment, either it's the lying leg curl and or the seated leg curl, they're both great exercises. Just keep that in mind. The goal here is to kind of make a distinction between the two and why you may want to, if you had to, choose between one or the other. Now, look, there are other great hamstring exercises as well. I used to, years ago when I used to really train, I remember one hamstring exercise that I loved to do all the time, and it was the single leg standing leg curl. Maybe at some point I'll do a brief video on that. One of my favorite, simply because I could isolate one leg at a time, and it allowed me to get into a good biomechanical position. And that's really what we're going to talk about with these two other exercises. Now, both of these machines are, they're common in the average training facility, big box gym. But keep in mind, if you're doing, for instance, small group training, right, you're probably not going to be doing either of these exercises. Generally, in a boutique style personal training scenario where it's a small, maybe a couple thousand square foot facility, and you're doing what we at Body Design University would recommend, which is small group training for 2, 3, 4, even up to 5 people. Generally, the total amount of equipment that you have is very, very limited with respect to machines. But with that being said, if you're doing one-on-one training, or even I used to do pairs training in a big box gym, and that was fine too, because I could have one person, for instance, doing lying leg curls and another person doing leg extensions, just as a for instance, and I could swap them back and forth. But in the case where you're doing like one-on-one training with individuals, it's a great option to look at either lying leg curls, great exercise, or seated leg curls. But here's the thing. I'm going to tell you right now that when push comes to shove, everything else being equal, guess which one I'm opting for? I'll let you think about that for a second as I pull up a little shot here for you, a little picture of the seated leg curl versus the lying leg curl. And before we do anything, what is the difference between the two? Or what can you see? The obvious is that you're lying down on one and you're sitting on another, but biomechanically, what is the main difference? And by the way, when you figure that out, that's the reason why I know I personally always go with one over the other if I had to pick. Normally in a leg training scenario, if I have access to both, I'm doing both, and I'm doing stiff-legged deadlifts as well. But in the case of you just got to do one or the other, somebody's got a gun up against your head. Which one are you going to do? Well, it's based on, again, everything else being equal. If you don't have any lower back issues, any knee issues, hip issues, anything like that, and you can do either one or the other, then what is the difference between the two? And now think about this. In a seated leg curl, what is different than in the lying leg curl? So think about that for a second, and you tell me what it is. Yes, it is the flexion at the hip. Flexion at the hip, and that's what's different. So in a seated leg curl, I hope you can see the difference, that in a seated position, the hips are flexed. See the difference, right? So flexed position versus in a lying leg curl, the hips are, by the way, on a good quality leg curl machine, there is a bend in the middle that actually forces the hips into a slightly flexed. So the main difference, especially if in this picture, is that the difference in hip flexion is pretty significant. I would say that in a standard leg curl, a seated leg curl, you are generally at a 90-degree hip flexed angle, meaning that the degree between the angle between the torso and the upper leg is roughly 90 degrees, and that's where the exercise starts and proceeds. Whereas in a lying leg curl, remember the ones that I used to use way back in the day when I first started, they were flat. So my angle of hip flexion or extension was basically 180 degrees of hip flexion, meaning I was flat out, kind of, seated totally flat. Whereas in this case, I would say this angle is, somebody help me out, maybe 150, 140 degrees. This is 90. And as you extend further and further, extend further out, then the angle of flexion increases, obviously. Flat, totally flat, lying totally on your belly would be 180 degrees. And now you have a little bit less angle than 180. In this case, I would say about 150, 140. It's not relevant. But the difference in hip flexion does what? And that's kind of the point. What is it that changes when the hips flex? Well, this has to do with the hamstrings themselves. Remember, the hamstrings, keep this in mind, are all three of those guys. Remember, there's a semi-membranosus, semi-tendinosus, and the biceps femoris. Okay, so those are the three muscles that make up the hamstring. Those three muscles all have the same, similar origin, meaning that they begin, the origin or the initiating portion of the three muscles of the hamstring are located where? On what's known as the pelvic tuberosity, right? The pelvis. So if the pelvis moves forward or backward, meaning if the hips flex or extend, okay, that will change the length of the hamstring. In other words, the hamstrings act, that's why we do stiff-legged deadlifts, right? Because when you do a stiff-legged deadlift, you're actually flexing the hip, and then and that puts tension on the hamstrings, right? If you're holding a bar. And then it's the hip extension, i.e. when you're standing back up, where the hamstrings are actually shortening under tension. So they go through a concentric contraction. In the case of a seated leg curl and a lying leg curl, the main action or movement that's occurring is at the knee, obviously. So the hip flexion or extension component is basically stabilized. And now all the movement activity occurs at the knee, right? So seated leg curl, and you go through knee flexion, okay? So what do the hamstrings do kinesiologically? Hip extension and knee flexion. So leg curls, either lying, seated, or standing single leg, for instance, all work at the level of the knee, going through flexion. And that's why you train your hamstrings on these exercises. So what's the difference? In a seated leg curl, because I am already in a hip flex position, my hamstrings are literally lengthened more than in a lying leg curl. Okay, let me say that again. The main difference and the reason why I prefer seated leg curls, okay, I gave it away. Seated leg curls is because in a seated leg curl, your hips are already flexed, which means you have pre-lengthened the hamstrings more than in a lying leg curl. Remember, it's not either or. I'm just kind of help you to understand. If somebody had a gun to your head and said, pick one, I'd pick the seated leg curl. Again, why? Because I start out in a the hamstrings are in a more lengthened position than in a lying leg curl. Now, truth be told, both exercises, of course, are great. Here's something just as an aside. So you get why I'm choosing one over the other. Maybe it's a minor issue, but I definitely like seated leg curls a whole lot. Love lying leg curls as well. And by the way, in both of these exercises, here's your little tip and aside. Do not lock the knees out. Don't allow the knees to lock out. Anytime you do hamstring exercises where the tension is occurring because of movement at the knee, in other words, knee flexion and extension, do not allow the knees to lock out. That puts a tremendous amount of stress on not only the knee joint itself, but on the tendinous attachments of those three hamstring muscles. And the reason is because, again, biomechanics, their insertions are not straight along from the femur down through the tibia and fibula complex. No, they actually attach on the lateral and the medial aspect of the knee joint itself. The biceps femoris attaches. Now remember, they both have the same origin in the hip, but their insertions go either medial or lateral to the knee joint. Biceps femoris, the long head, inserts actually laterally into the head of the fibula, whereas both the semimembranosus, semitendinosus attach medially, both onto the tibia and the other medial aspect of the knee. So without getting too complicated on that end of it, don't lock the knee out. How's that? Always keep the knee. And you'll notice that just as a, for instance, in this picture, it depends on the client as to how close you get to lockout. I'm not sure. Again, everybody's different, but as long as the knee doesn't lock out, you're good to go. Make sure you're maintaining tension. And same thing with the seated leg curl. Do not allow the knee to lock out. Number one, it'll maintain tension, and just like I said, will reduce injury. So what's my favorite? Seated. But they're like really, really close together when it comes to which one I would choose or not choose. But I like to do both. And if I have a preference, I'm going to go with seated. Give them both a try if you're doing one-on-one training and you're doing this in a big box gym that has the equipment. Just keep in mind, if you don't have the equipment, stiff-legged deadlifts, both with barbells, dumbbells, offsets, things like that. As always, any comments you have, please leave them in the comment section below. If you have not done so, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the notification bell as well. And if you haven't done so, we do have a private Facebook group that we would really appreciate if you went over to and got into that. We're just always trying to help those individuals that are not trainers, that are becoming trainers, to become industry leading trainers and get certified. If you're already a trainer and you're already certified, then we just want to help you to kind of dial it in and, tweak the carburetor, so to speak, and get better and better at providing great service to your clients. And that's what we do here at Body Design University. Let us know if you want to be a part of our online or our live course that we hold in Atlanta, 2 weeks. 2 weeks, like a boot camp that we have in Atlanta, Georgia. You click on that link below and that will get you to our admissions team to help you out. As always, got questions? Let us know. Leave the comments below and we will see you next week. Thanks.